Mr. Daniel Yergin joins me now. He is the Vice Chairman of IHS Markit and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, well-known in the energy circles. So thank you so much for taking the time. When we look at this energy dialogue, how important is it?
I think this was a very important dialogue because it brought together producers and consumers, and so I think it was a very substantive accomplishment by the International Energy Forum and the International Gas Union to assemble this group, and it was particularly significant to do it in India because India's weight is growing in the global economy of energy because of its growing demand and also its growing reach. And so to have this here, to have the Indian perspective, the regional perspective, and the global perspective, I think was very constructive for everyone involved.
When we look at the evolution of the gas industry, and I know you wrote about this in your book, The Quest, tell us a little about, particularly about LNG. How is that developing and where do you see it going now?
So in The Quest, I had a chapter called Gas on Water, which was really about the development of the LNG business, which goes back in its modern terms to the early 1950s in response to the London fog of 1952. And that led to a desire to move away from coal and led to the first shipments of LNG from, of all places, Louisiana to the United Kingdom. Of course, in the many, many decades since then, this business has really developed, and in a period of just 10 years or so, it's more than doubled. And I think what we've seen, and it was striking when I was working on The Quest, that you could see the buildup of supply coming from so many different directions, and then a new player came in, and that of course is shale gas, and thus the US becoming an exporter of LNG rather than a large importer, which was believed to be the case until around 2007, 2008. So now the market has changed, and one of the things we were talking about is the fact that this is going to be a market that's going to be oversupplied for as much as almost a decade, and that means a lot of change for all the different players. It means a change in strategy as people adapt to it, and yet also there'll be a need for new investment well before the end of the surplus because of the lead times it takes. So those were some of the major discussions that we had. Others were about the role of natural gas in terms of meeting climate objectives, and there a very important fact to note is that for the US to have had credibility in the Paris climate negotiations would not have happened had it not been for shale gas, which enabled the United States to bring down its carbon emissions back to the level of the early 1990s, even though its economy has grown so substantially since then.
What can we do, or what can countries do you think, to actually help to boost the demand for natural gas? With so much supply on the market here, you know, we need to see stronger demand. And when we listen to the arguments in favor of natural gas, they do sound very, interesting and optimistic and appealing indeed.
I think that the challenge for gas is that we have competitive energy markets. So gas is competing on one side with coal, which can be very cheap, on the other hand with renewables, where the costs are coming down and there's strong government support, and they're all fighting for a share of the power market. Obviously people are looking at natural gas in terms of transportation, and here in India they're looking to replace diesel or part of their diesel in long distance trucks, lorries with LNG. So developing other markets is going to be an important part of the future of natural gas.
When we look at the oil price and we see a bit of strength coming back in the oil price, will it naturally follow that we might see strength in the gas price?
Certainly it will be for gas that's indexed to oil, which still is the bulk of the larger part of gas that's sold. At the same time, you have gas that's sold on spot markets, and the relationship between the spot markets and the index market, or the long-term contract market, that's continually changing. So I think that in terms of, gas is still going to be competitive, but a higher price where it's indexed probably leads to some advantage for coal. And so I think that you have to think about these markets as competitive markets. Of course, LNG in general, for a large part, wants to have contracted markets and know where it's going to go. But I think it's going to become more and more of a commodity market, particularly as you see more supply coming in from the United States. And one thing we see in our IHS Markit studies, every time we look at the US natural gas base, it seems bigger than it was last time.
But despite the challenges in the market, are you optimistic for demand growth in the longer term? I mean, ultimately, we look at growing population, hopefully, growing finances and consumer groups. So, what's the outlook for the future? Would you say?
Well, in all of our scenarios, the only fossil fuel that shows growth in every scenario is natural gas. And natural gas is going to increase its market share of the total energy mix. It's going to increase relative to oil, relative to coal. It will overtake coal as a global energy source. So 1.8, 2% growth in natural gas a year seems to be a very reasonable goal. I think, though, that at the same time, the gas industry will need to deal with these challenges of building infrastructure, building pipelines, getting projects done. And I think we see that in North America, we see that in India, we see it in other parts of the world. And so I think that natural gas really needs to have a coherent narrative about its role in the energy mix and the impact it can have. But certainly it's a contribution to economic growth, and as a lower carbon fuel, it's a contribution to addressing emissions as well. So I think the takeaways from the gas summit, I would say they're a positive, growing role. Same time, you have to be realistic about the challenges and the fact that markets are going to be competitive and even more competitive in the future than they are today.
One final question. For the policymakers, if there was a message that you need them to pay heed to, what do you think that should be right now? What would you say?
The message, I think, for policymakers is that natural gas has a very important role to play in the energy mix, and that not having obstacles in the way is very important, and addressing the kind of obstacles to ensure that it is part of the energy mix, and that it's taken in a way. I think one of the points that got made in the summit is that while you can see the prospects for gas, you also see that if you look at Europe and other places, government policymakers tend to underestimate the role of natural gas and look in other directions. And I think that's a cost in terms of the economic benefits and also the environmental benefits.